Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Esther Garcia. I'm the guest curator of Enduring Querencias, Lost and Reclaimed Expressions of Home. I'll also be the moderator for today. This exhibit is a collection of photographs, poems, and reflections of the South Valley. This work has been collected throughout my research. The exhibit of 23 vinyl panels sheds light on the exploration of a South Valley's daughter, photo-poetic journey on mapping my own Querencia. It revealed the remembrance of overlooked people whose stories make up the South Valley's cultural landscape. The exhibit centered on the love of home and reclaiming Querencia. Beyond the academics, the citations, and the qualitative findings, this exhibit allowed me to give back to my community and intertwine with the people. The exhibit has stood as a visual marker of the pride and traditions hidden in the area beyond the master narrative. The collection is a reminder of the South Valley's desire to leave a vocal legacy. Many of the counter stories revealed people stitched to the place and the enduring influence of the community that dare to challenge barrio's storylines. The pandemic of 2020 did not kill my vision or silence my participants' enduring voice. In fact, it reminded us of how important and sacred home is. The storytelling, poetic verses, and reflections illuminated the area and rekindled a place not lost in the people's hearts. We will begin today by starting out with our distinguished guest panelists who have generously agreed in sharing in today's conversation. Myrriah Gómez is an assistant professor in the Honors College at the University of New Mexico. She holds a bachelor's degree from New Mexico Highlands University and a master's degree from the University of New Mexico. She earned her PhD in English with an emphasis in Latina and Latino studies from the University of Texas at San Antonio in 2014. Myrriah received a Ford Foundation pre-doctoral fellowship from the National Academies in 2011, which enabled her to return to New Mexico to conduct empirical and archival research for her dissertation. She received the UNM Faculty of Color Award for teaching in 2015. Myrriah's current book project is entitled Nuclear Nuevo Mexico, Identity, Ethnicity, and Resistance in Atomic Third Spaces. She is a proud Nuevo Mexicana who is always in search of ways to better the lives of New Mexicans. Let us welcome Myrriah Gómez. Moises Gonzales is an associate professor of urban design in the Community and Regional Planning program at the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of New Mexico. He also serves as the director of the Research Center for Raza Planning, a community outreach center within the School of Architecture and Planning, whose mission is to provide technical assistance in the areas of community development, design, and natural resource planning for traditional communities throughout New Mexico. Moises's teaching focuses on physical planning and urban design, as well as historical preservation of the Southwest. Moises is co-editor with Enrique Lamadrid of the recent book Nación Genízara, Ethnogenesis, Place and Identity in New Mexico by University of New Mexico Press, 2019. Moises Gonzales is also co-author along with Robert William Pyatt, Jr. of the book Slavery in the Southwest, Genízaro, Identity, Dignity, and the Law by Carolina Academic Press, 2019. Let us welcome Moises Gonzales. Patricia Perea is a published poet. She is currently the History and Literary Arts educator at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. She also teaches in the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies at the University of New Mexico. Let us welcome Patricia Perea. Levi Romero was selected as the inaugural New Mexico Poet Laureate in 2020 and New Mexico Centennial Poet in 2012. His most recent book is the co-edited anthology Querencia, Reflections on the New Mexico Homeland. His two collections of poetry are A Poetry of Remembrance, New and Rejected Works, and In the Gathering of Silence. He is co-author of Sagrado, a photo poetics across the Chicano homeland. He's an assistant professor in the Chicana and Chicano Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. Let us welcome Levi Romero.
We'd like to start by asking each one of the panelists to just, introduce yourselves and kind of your relationship to this idea of querencia and how we can understand it. And then Esther will follow with some more targeted questions, but we wanted to make sure you have a little more chance to kind of introduce yourself and kind of talk about the idea of querencia just, in general. So, somebody want to start? I just realized we don't have an order. Who wants to start? I'm gonna ask Levi to start then, and we'll go backwards.
All right, the sacrificial poet again. For me, I mean, I grew up hearing the term querencia and querencias, which is plural. Querencias is the animals and the natural environment, the people themselves. And querencia is the place where one is born and raised. That's the way we identify with that term in the villages of northern New Mexico. And so I started using that term in my work when Allison Hagerman, who was in honors, a professor, adjunct professor in honors, and I applied for a grant, a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities on place and identity. And when we were thinking about what we would do if we received the grant, I referred back to the term and the word, the concept of querencia, and we applied it to the grant. And we actually did, in fact, receive a grant to do a class on place and identity. And as part of the grant, we were to develop a class on place and identity. And so I called my class Querencia, Home, Place, and Identity. And I've been teaching that class ever since. I think that was like about 5 years ago, maybe now. So that's really where I started with that. And then eventually it led to a conversation with my co-editors of the Querencia Reflections of the New Mexico Homeland book with Dr. Vanessa Fonseca Chavez and Spencer Herrera. And again, we explored the theme of querencia, and we decided let's just pursue an anthology of emerging scholarship on that subject. And so that's kind of been my work around querencia for the last few years. And it's great that there are several people here who have contributed to that anthology. Myrriah and Moises are in that anthology as well. And of course, I work very closely with Patricia Perea too, and then Esther, of course, in her work, her thesis project on enduring querencias. So I'm glad to see how that theme continues to evolve and move forward, and different people do different things around that theme. It's really wonderful to see it expanding.
Wonderful. Patricia, you want to dive in?
Sure. So querencia is actually not a term I grew up with, but it is something I felt. And that's kind of the way I look at it. Is it something that resides very, very deeply in me? Because I did not grow up actually in New Mexico. I grew up in the Texas Panhandle. But I think it counts. I went to Clovis a lot for shopping for Kmart and all of that stuff. So it was actually the big town around where I'm from. But technically what I call it all is, what it is all called is the Llano Estacado. So that's where I grew up. My grandparents were New Mexican. They were from Delia, which is a little town between next to Anton Chico, between Las Vegas and Santa Rosa. So I grew up with them, hearing these accents, hearing these words. I always joke that I think I was older when I finally realized Wenobai was not the same word. But it's like all of these things that I grew up with, but I actually didn't have the term for it until I came here for grad school, because I got my PhD at UNM. And then all of a sudden I saw and heard all of these things that I had grown up with. And it wasn't until a long time later that I realized there was this term. And so I'm really, really happy to be invited onto this panel. But that's how I kind of experienced querencia.
Thank you. I think that brings us to Moises.
Can you hear me? Yeah, all right. So first of all, I'd like to thank Esther for putting this together. I'm so excited to drop by the exhibit, and now that things are opening up a little bit, I really want to spend some time and go by in the next week or so. We got some nice days. So for me, I kind of like with Levi, I heard it in, kind of the vernacular. That was just kind of the kind of, things that you learn. Kind of like querencia is also associated with herencia, right? Which are kind of linked, coupled terms in terms of language and identity of place. But I took a class with Tomas Atencio when I was at UNM as an undergrad. And then, it was kind of opening in terms of like the work that he was working on with the Rosolana, La Academia. And then after I finished my master's in urban planning, I landed up in northern New Mexico. And at the same time, Paula Garcia was working with organizing with the Acequia Association. Miguel Santisteban was working on all these traditional saving of agricultural seed saving techniques. I was doing a lot of work with the Mercedes, the land grants. And at this time, it was a couple of kind of like groundbreaking pieces, I would say, was you had Devon Peña's book that really kind of conceptualized Chicano bioregionalism, right? And then there was a groundbreaking essay by Esteban Arellano about the land ethic of Querencia. So here, we start looking at how traditional knowledge and traditional concepts start pushing back around what at the time was very kind of a privileged European, I'd call it even an aspect of white supremacy within the land ethic movement. And so for me, it was groundbreaking to see this kind of pushback in traditional knowledge that kind of took off my work that was connected to my community that I'll talk a little bit. And where we're at now to where we're actually seeing, Querencia, because of traditional knowledge, finding a grounding in a Chicano land ethic that we kind of hear within, indigenous communities, the 7th generation environmental kind of planning model or environmental consciousness model. While for Genizaros and Chicanos in New Mexico, the concept of querencia really becomes our framework for grounding those principles. Thank you.
I'll jump in, Beth. And I want to thank also Esther and Beth for organizing, and Esther for inviting me to be on this panel. I love all three of these people who are joining us on the panel. For me, querencia, I grew up in El Rancho in the Poake Valley, and I laugh at Patricia's story that bueno by is one word, and it brings to mind something that happened to me when I was driving. I was young, I don't know how old I was, and we were driving through Espanola, and I told my parents, or I asked my parents, what does Feregas mean? And they're like, what are you talking about? It was the Feral Gas Company, and I was like reading it as Spanish. But I think querencia, like in thinking about it in this academic space, I was teaching at Northern in like 2012 at Northern New Mexico College. And we had just, we were having actually the first New Mexico Histories Conference, Historias de Nuevo Mexico. And I was having a conversation with Esteban Arellano. And after the conference ended, he emailed me Taos where cultures met 400 years ago. And I was at the time, I had piloted and I was teaching a class, History and Culture of Northern New Mexico. But that essay and where he talks about querencia was like the missing piece that I needed to finish my dissertation. And I was able to really embrace thinking about it as an academic concept. And I think Levi made this point earlier, the way that people are talking about querencia now, and really have given it like another life, breathed new life into it. And so I'm just really happy to be in this conversation right now.
Thank you. The first question I'm about to pose was bounced off a real life experience and served as a teaching tool with my kids. My family was out to dinner and we saw a middle-aged couple in a nearby booth that were swiping up and down as an elderly man and woman sat across from them in the same booth. The situation continued throughout breakfast, and an elderly couple was quiet and patient, and very few words were exchanged between the two. I used this moment as a teaching tool with my kids, and it was easy for them to see that the scenario was very sad. This is not my moment of judgment because we are all guilty of these infractions. But I want to ask the panelist is, how can we balance technology in ways that are impactful to our experiences of Querencia between phones, social media, and computers that overwhelm us on a daily basis? Does anybody want to go first, or should we start in the order the bios were read?
Sure, I can take it first, Esther.
Thank you.
You know, it's such a complicated issue and a complicated topic because for so long there are some of us who had pushed against technology, pushed up against it, and now we kind of got, as of a year ago, right, we got thrown into like living our whole lives in this technological space. Those who know me know I'm not on Facebook. I don't do Twitter. I am on Instagram, but not during Lent. And so I have my own like really interesting relationship with social media, but as Margot, who's on the call, will tell you, my phone is always in my hand and I'm always texting. So, you know, I think that in terms of Querencia in the last year, one thing that's been really clear is that we've needed technology to stay in touch with our Querencia, with our communities, with our family. When the pandemic started a year ago, almost a year ago next week, right? And everything went into lockdown, I was 7 months pregnant. And so it was, the week that everything shut down, and I told my sister, we have to cancel the baby shower. And she didn't talk to me for a week. She was so mad. And the day of my baby shower, you know, nobody had really used Zoom before. And I hadn't even showered. I was so upset. I was sitting on the couch and my husband called me into the kitchen and there was my whole family and friends on Zoom. So sorry. So I think that in terms of Querencia, we've really needed technology to keep us close to our loved ones in the last year, especially, right? So that's where I'll end for now.
I think
Thank you, Myrriah.
that, you know, continues the love that, you know, that we are supposed to feel with those emotions of Querencia. And we'll move on to the next panelist who chimed in there, which is Levi. So I'll give you a go.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. No, thank you, Myrriah. That was beautiful. I just kind of will begin with this, and I'm not usually good at answering questions, but it's just been a bad habit of mine my whole life. But no, so in Dixon, where I'm from, in Budo, years ago, as a young man, when we were low-riding cruisers, there was this one area in town where we used to congregate because it was like one of the few places where you could get FM reception. And so the cruisers would eventually wind up going over to this place that we called FM Hill. And so that became sort of like our generation, one of our generation's Resolana gathering places. And then in more recent times, there's also another place now in Dixon where people go to get cell phone reception. And so what tends to happen is that they go there to use their cell phones, and while they're there using their cell phones, somebody else shows up, and then somebody else shows up, and then sometimes oftentimes what happens is that people are there to use the cell phones to talk to somebody else on the phone, then they start talking to each other. So that's really cool how technology really, and the radio, for example, brought us together in the community in these informal Resolana spaces, you know. But I agree, Myrriah, it's like there is that balance that we're looking for between technology and traditional modes of communication, right? How do we balance them out? And in some ways, because of the technology and Zoom and I probably actually and the cell phone text and all, I probably communicate more so now with my siblings than I ever have in years before. So I'm thankful for that. Everybody lives away from each other, so you know that technology actually brings us closer together. So, que vamos a hacer? You know, I've been resistant to it too as well.
Thank you, Levi. I think we will go ahead and move to Moises next.
Okay, yeah, so my thoughts on this is that, you know, I think the technology and as it relates to Querencia has been happening, at least in my community, for a while. In fact, a lot of the work writing that I've worked on Genízaro communities, rural mountain Genízaro communities, is that I think like Levi said, and before we started about, you know, how much attention Genízaro has been getting in the last several years, and the terms Querencia, how they've been growing so much and getting interest in international scholarly communities, but also, you know, just an overall interest even within media and whatnot, is like with cell phones and the advent of the smartphone, I think, like, you know, a lot of what happens is you'll get maybe some primos come from out of town and come in and they'll come to watch a dance. Somebody snap some pictures of the matachines, or maybe the Comanches, or up in Abiquiu, take some pictures of some of the Pueblo dances there. And so now with YouTube and all these things and social media, people are seeing like, okay, well, what are those rituals, and asking questions, and people are wondering kind of the connections between even like Genízaro communities and indigenous communities and how that's centered, right? And I think even looking at the matachines, is I see it like in northern Mexico, where you'll have maybe folks live in the United States go to their little pueblitos for the feast, or maybe a Tarahumara, a Raramuri village, or a Yaqui village in Sonora, and then, you know, it'll be on YouTube, and all of a sudden, like in the last 5 years, and it's happening across, you know, communities in the Southwest and even northern Mexico, is that you can actually Google these little small fiestas in rural small villages and get like glimpses into like these rituals and see like, wow, these dances are related, they're different, they're and then so I think that's just kind of adaptation. And you know, the thing about adaptation and culture and Querencia is that I think culture always has to be adaptive just along with technology, because if it's not, it won't live on, it won't adapt itself into the new world. So I know there's always a resistance to how technologies abrupt traditional knowledge, but I think I think we've always learned that they've had to adapt over time in order to perpetuate themselves, to be relevant to the next generation.
Thank you, Moises. Patricia?
You know, there's a couple of things that's been said that brought these to mind. First of all, my nephew was born in May, and so my brother and his wife had to cancel their baby shower too in March. So I didn't get to go to that either. But when I'm thinking about technology, and to answer the direct question, one of the things that's been really, really nice for me is, like I said, I grew up in Texas, and so I'm the oldest granddaughter and grandchild, period, on both sides of my family. And I'm the only one that my grandparents, who are from New Mexico, knew. So what I've been able to do is use pictures that I inherited from them, scan them, send them to my cousins, like via sometimes social media, sometimes text. And then we get to tell stories that way. So they want to know, you know, who is this person? Who is this person? And in that way, I can tell these family stories about, you know, like something as simple as my grandma teaching me embroidery when I was a little girl turned into me being able to talk about colcha, or something about weaving that I'd heard about my great grandmother. Now we can talk about not just weaving, but the WPA and what that did for Nuevo Mexicanos during the Depression. So it's like, I've been seeing like how doing this with family photos has enabled me to tell a whole story of a whole community that my cousins just didn't get to know, because the reason we ended up in Texas, and this is another project that that Levi talks about is we left to work in the fields, right? So we left New Mexico to work in the cotton fields in West Texas. And one of my favorite little pieces of a story is I was talking to Roberto Mondragon, because he's really good friends with my primo. And I was talking to him not that long ago, and he worked the same cotton fields that my grandparents worked in West Texas in this little town called Muleshoe. So I did not know that this was part of a manito thing, except that everybody called them manitos. And I grew up with that term, had no clue what it meant until much, much later. So it's like these kinds of, you know, ¿cómo se dice? These kinds of technologies enable families to connect and to tell stories.
I can really appreciate that because in my research, I did use technology often. I was using recording devices and capturing images that maybe somebody across the world was not able to see what was going on in my little South Valley community. So I can appreciate that use of that as a form of storytelling. So we'll move on. Thank you guys for your honesty. We have seen iPads being used for dying patients in hospitals during a no visitor policy during COVID. It has connected the hopeful with those impending death. Technology has allowed closure for many families who may not have had it otherwise. My question for the panelists is, and you've touched on this a little bit, do you believe COVID-19 reminds us of what we are sacrificing in a tech-based world, or has it aided us in reconnecting? We'll go in any order if anybody wants to chime in.
I'll go. I'm with Levi in that, yeah, I probably talk to family more via tech than I have, you know, previously, my extended family in Texas. And that's been good. You know, that's been really, really, really good. And I appreciate, you know, with students getting to have, it's harder, and I don't think any of us who teach would not say it was harder to meet with students on Zoom via in person, but it does allow, oddly, for more in-depth conversations, at least for me. That being said, you know, I haven't been able to really talk to my elders who live here in Santa Fe or in Tesuque because they're elders in like their 70s and 80s, and they themselves will not get on the computer unless somebody's gonna help. So I haven't been able to go to any of their things, but with my younger cousins in other places. So I think it's like it does this weird kind of zero thing sort of game in my experience.
Yeah, I don't know if it's okay if I jump in, but I've been thinking a lot about this is that, you know, when COVID hit, we had, of course, you know, our land grant is in the east of Albuquerque in the Harris Canyon. We had right when COVID hit, we were working with ancestral lands we've been working on this Conway Creek restoration project where we have a lot of invasives taking over because it's not as cold anymore, right? So the Chinese elms and the and salt cedars getting more aggressive, taking over where, you know, what's the habitat for willows and cottonwoods. So, I mean, the one aspect where I think technology can't fix, I mean, it can facilitate certain things, but at the end of the day, we can't talk about how we're going to go and restore a landscape, right? So I think, the reality, kind of like what Patricia was saying, I think a lot of us have used that, but at the same thing, a lot of our elders in Carnuel, we weren't able to do those sort of things. You know, we've had some deaths from COVID. We've had to adjust. We've had to have funerals. We've had to have, we've had a couple dances where, you know, we had folks separated, and we've done a couple things we've had to done. We've done stuff with the hermanos in Carnuel, which Levi is an hermano there. So we've had to make adjustments, but we haven't been able to fully leverage. And you can't just fully leverage technology to maintain a landscape. And I think maybe it taught us how to facilitate conversations and learn some things. But the reality is the land needs the connection with our hands, and it needs the connections with our community touching that land. So although I appreciate the technology and what we've learned from it, and hopefully things never go back to that sort of normal and that happened from COVID, and we learned from that. But at the end of the day, there's going to come the point where we physically have to exchange our seed. We physically have to do collective work to maintain those things. And so although we've learned a lot and technology has fixed things, technology at the end of the day can only do so much, and we gotta get back to work in those lands.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that point that you're making, Moises, because I think that I think about like my life in two parts sometimes, right? Like there's the part of me that's tied to my Querencia up north, in which there are growing seasons and planting seasons, and we've had to figure out how to do those in this COVID environment, right? So for instance, like one of us would go help my dad grind blue corn and do atole in October. I went, and my dad helped my sister do the capulin, and we split everything up in ways that was really strange. I didn't tie ristras this year for the first year in a long time. One of my siblings did it, and with my dad. And so I think that those technologies or those practices, right, have been really strange, because that's when family comes together, and we have a big extended family, and my family spends a lot of time together, and we haven't. And just knowing, like, my family doesn't know my daughter, and there were 3 cousins babies born within the last few months, so it's been really weird. But then in another way, like that other part of my life, like Patricia's talking about, our work life and our teaching life, I've tried to create Resolana in other ways. Like I have a writing group that I formed that meets every day. And so I get to see, kind of like what Levi was talking about earlier, I get to see my comadres writing on Zoom every morning. Half the time we're in our pajamas, and it's just cool. And that's something that would have not ever happened before COVID, probably not in the same way. So, there are things that I would like Moises said, I would like to be able to carry post-pandemic into these technologies. The other thing, Esther, that you're talking about that comes to mind is when we're recording interviews. Zoom has created a very easy platform to record interviews. Now, coordinating those interviews, because if we're recording elders, like Patricia says, my parents don't get on the computer. A lot of people from that generation in my community don't get on the computer. But if we're able to get people onto Zoom, we can really be recording some amazing things right now. And so, it's hard not to be like a total Luddite and just say, push against the technology. I think there are parts of it that I'm embracing and happy to embrace.
I agree. I mean, I think that as much as we want to say, oh, that's just not part of the process when we're, transferring knowledge, but here we are today on a Saturday, and we're doing that still. So I would agree with that. Thank you.
Can I add something just real quick?
Of course.
Is it possible to let me share my screen? Because there's something that I really want to see, that I want you all to see, that addresses this. That was a photo I took last year in Bernalillo. Is that possible?
Of course. Elizabeth, are you able to do that on your end?
Thank
you.
You should be able
to
do that right now. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna try with the desktop. So these were photos I took this year in Bernalillo, and it says town facilities will be closed Monday, August 11th in observance of Fiesta de San Lorenzo. And then the next photo, and let me see, I'm gonna unshare it because I just want to make sure I get this right before I go to the next photo. The next photo is this one. So I'm gonna share the screen again. That I think captures what we're talking about. The tradition continues. Las Matachines Dance of Bernalillo lecture on the history and meaning of the San Lorenzo fiestas. And then it gives you the website where to go. And I think that's a lot of what we experienced this year, and like what Moises was talking about too, where there were these traditions that are so big. And like Myrriah is talking about, that they were transferred online, and that was good because it probably gave a bigger audience. but it was hard because we didn't actually get to participate, you know, or go or see or hear in the same way. So anyway, I just wanted to show those.
Cool.
Thank you, Patricia. Also, Moises, did you also have something that you wanted to share from your screen?
Maybe in a minute.
Okay.
I'll let the conversation flow. Maybe as a wrap up, I'll show some images.
Oh, perfect. We all can recognize that anything that is not nurtured is at risk of dying or being lost in Querencia. So my question for the panelists is, in a world moving so fast, is there any way that we can nurture culture and preserve traditional methods of communicating within the community? Examples are oral histories, pláticas, or resolanas.
I'll go ahead and jump in on that one. And I think it relates back to the previous questions too as well, in terms of like what we've sacrificed and, you know, nothing like COVID to remind us of the blessings that we had before COVID. In agrarian traditions, for example, even just like last year after COVID and the pandemic and everything, in the villages of northern New Mexico, the annual acequia cleanings, for example, some of them were canceled because of COVID. And so for the first time in 400 years, right, these acequias were not cleaned by the parciantes of the community because of COVID. And so that is certainly something that we miss in terms of the agrarian traditions. The pláticas, for example, that were so common on a daily basis at the little co-op tiendita there in Dixon, with a couple of the regular guys that are always there, Fisher and Clovis, you know, and they make a space, they create a space where people coming in and out of the store sit down and they hang out and they talk, and that was gone too. So that was really evident and missing from the community, you know. So those are the sacrifices that we've really seen before our very own eyes. And on the other hand, something to alluding to what Moises was saying is like with our hands and reconnecting back to the Querencia, back to the natural landscape, back to the tierra, back to the land. We've all seen that there are more people than ever on the bosque, walking trails, in the foothills, hiking around. You have never seen so many people hiking and walking as you do these days since the pandemic. And so that has brought people back to the land, back to the landscape. And that's really great to see. And I think that especially for older people who grew up so connected to the land, it's great to reconnect again. For little kids that are growing up like that, unfortunately, in this time, but again, this will be part of their memory. Last summer, I think you were taking some amazing images, Esther, at the Rio Grande with families, entire families, you know, hanging out by the Rio Grande. And those kids are going to grow up with that memory. And if at some point in their lives they move away from ever going down to the river, they will remember that and they will want to go back and revisit those spaces again. So there is that sacrifice, but there is that reconnection again. And the other is like how it has impacted our spiritual religious traditions, especially amongst the elderly. And now during Lent, for example, where they can't congregate to do the rosarios or the Stations of the Cross on Fridays, you know, and so they've been very limited in terms of those kinds of gatherings. But it's interesting, one of the things that some of the moradas, some of the hermandads are doing across the state is that they're actually having the Stations of the Cross and the rosaries on Zoom. And what that does, you know, in a positive way is that it enables others who have been closed off from those kinds of settings to be able to participate, you know. So in that way, it's opened up this beautiful, nurturing, you know, lugar sagrado to the rest of the world, and people are invited to join, you know, the hermanos when they're praying, and so that's beautiful too. So there are sacrifices, but you know, culture is a living organism, and so it has to adapt, just as Moises was saying, it has to adapt to survive. And we're learning like our ancestors learned Our antepasados learned to adapt to survive, and we're having to learn to adapt and survive in our own time, in our own moment.
I'm just going to, maybe if I could share screen for a second, if that's okay. I think I have access. I don't know if you could see this. Can you see this, this flyer? So this flyer is interesting because it's, you look at the date, you know, it's February 29th. That was right before the shutdown, right? So going back to your question, Esther, I think it goes beyond us and it goes to the youth. So we had we created a youth danzantes group because, you know, when the fiestas happen, you know, only 12 danzantes get selected. So, and, you know, for each feast. So that's not, and you have all these young ones that want to dance and we need to transfer them. So when they come up, but we don't want, if they're not chosen a particular year. So we started a youth group where we get asked to dance for different kind of more culturally secular kind of events. Like, you know, and so we started this youth group so we could just start sending them and they're really excited. And I don't know if I can move through these. Oh, there's JJ's motorcycle. I thought I was going to be able to get, but anyway, we had this youth practice and it's kind of interesting. We were able to, we did this and then the shutdown. So over the year through what we did is we sent them, we gave them CDs and we sent them CDs with the music to and practice their steps and whatever, knowing that we'll come back. So things are going to open up. We're going to get back. It's going to be different. But I think this was a pause point. But again, I think we'll still have to come back and do the things that we do because at the end of the day, you know, some of these ritual dances are based in harmonious exchanges of rhythms, right? So you can't, the whole Matachinas and Comanche dances are in effect kind of a collective action. It's a mutual action. It's where you're kind of creating a simultaneous harmony with one. That's the lesson, right? Because when we go back as a community, it's kind of the lesson is we have to maintain our querencia and our connection going to something like, you know, into our collective caretaking of our landscapes, right? So again, I think we've learned some things how to adapt, and hopefully we come back with even more what I would say animo, as we would say, more animo with the young people to step into the tareas that they need to do to maintain querencia.
Did everybody get a chance?
I want to
Patricia.
add one thing to that as well. Is one of the first things that surprised me, and it was all the way back, and I'm sure Myrriah will remember this in 2013, when we were at Northern, 2012, I can't even remember, but there was this moment where they were starting to do distance learning, or they were doing distance learning. So there was things happening at UNM and things at UNM Taos. And the person who was doing them was one of our colleagues, Carmen Zamora. So she was the one who was like doing distance learning. But you know, that seemed kind of new, and all of this, it seemed like new technology. But then I read Resolana by Tomás Atencio, and he's got sort of this thing where he does talk about the benefit of distance learning and what that can mean for outreach to communities. And I know, Myrriah, you must have experienced that a little bit at UNM Los Alamos.
I didn't teach at UNM Los Alamos ever.
Oh, I don't know why I thought you were at Los Alamos.
I was at Gallup,
That's
which is actually a totally different situation, because a lot of the students that we have at UNM Gallup don't have, who live out on the res, don't have access to internet. So we had very, very few distance learning and online classes. But yeah, it's funny, Patricia, because right before you got on the call, Levi and I were sitting here rapping about Resolana. Divana and I had been talking about it, so it was actually already on my desk. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, they've been talking about this for years in some of the ways that Levi has brought up.
Yeah, one of those things that Tomas writes about and what he used to talk about all the time, even before the internet, of course, was the concept of resolana electrónica. And that's what we do in my classes, you know, for during discussions is we have a resolana and it's on Zoom. So we calling it resolana electrónica, you know, and we're taking advantage of the medium and just doing what we've always done is have pláticas, you know, just like what we're doing today.
There are locations that are experiencing some, like Myrriah said, some gaps in like internet and, you know, being able to be involved in these conversations. Does anybody have that same issue with students, and how do you bring them in to have those conversations, you know, if they are having like internet issues or they're just not within service areas?
Esther, this is Margaret Romero, and I am not a member of the panel, but I do have something to share. May I please?
Of course, go ahead.
I've been very blessed to have my prima, who allows me to join teachers on a Zoom. They meet informally about once or twice a week on Zoom. 3 of them teach on the res, and they do have problems connecting with the internet because they don't have Wi-Fi. But interestingly enough, the post office in those outward communities does have Wi-Fi. So guess what? All of a sudden, the postmasters were calling and saying, well, you know, we have like 15 people here in the lobby, and they're all young people, and they all have computers. And so one of the postmasters went out to ask them, pues, ¿qué pasa? Why are you here? Well, it turns out that all the kids would load up in a truck, which was very, very common aquí in Nuevo Mexico. A person would drive them to the post office. They would have their computers. They would do their distance learning in the lobbies. People would step over them to get to the post office boxes, to get to their mail. And that's how they would learn. But it was challenging. Thank you.
I think thanks for that, Margaret. I think that's a really neat story. Also, what comes to mind is, I don't know if anybody saw the news today or yesterday that Jemez Pueblo just is hooking up, like, I think it's like 500 new homes to broadband connections, which is really gonna radically change that community to be able to have internet like that. The other thing that comes to mind for me is my sister, who teaches at Pablo Roybal Elementary School in Poake, and who lives like half a mile from Poake Pueblo. When everybody got sent home to teach online, right? She didn't have internet worth a darn to have to teach, basically. And it reminded me, we started having this conversation of a Santa Fe Reporter article that had come out a couple of years ago. And it was a woman who lived nearby San Lifonso, who was complaining that we have horrible internet connections in the valley. And she said, we live 15 minutes where the atomic bomb was developed, and we don't have Wi-Fi. And so, you know, in terms of technology, it's something that I've always been thinking about. That's my area of research, is the effect of the labs, which Atencio and Tony Mares write about in Resolana, in part, right? And Esteban was always writing about in terms of Querencia, and how the labs and the nuclear industry the technology of those industries and that industry has affected Nuevo Mexicanos. And not just, you know, Pueblo and Hispano communities and Isaro communities, in all of these really interesting ways. So, you know, it begs the question, why are we 50th in science education in New Mexico? And, you know, why are we at the last of all these lists when we have 2 national laboratories, scientific laboratories in this state? So I'll leave it at that.
So we are coming close to time, Are there any other final thoughts from the panelists that want to interject at any point right now? What about any questions from our participants?
I also just want to say for everyone, if you haven't been looking at the chat, there's some great resources in the chat. So thanks to everyone who's added book titles and links. So make sure you check that out before you leave while you're thinking about your questions.
I have a question. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts on Querencia, and thank you to Esther and Dustin for organizing. I wanted to ask if you all could have any thoughts on the application or the utility of Querencia outside of a New Mexico specific context. And you know, I'm imagining that this term isn't just a New Mexico thing. This could be useful for other people in different places. And so I was, yeah, hoping you all could speak to that. And thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think this is what I was talking about when I was talking about the context of Texas. I mean, yes, my family has a New Mexican connection on my dad's side, but on my mom's side, they are from South Texas. And I think in that respect, it gives people a way for thinking through what home means, what geography, what landscape mean, and how those can inform who we are. You know, because like I was kind of saying, you know, and I know you're in California, right? And so we have this, you know, I have a lot of friends who are from California, and we were just talking, one of my friends is here with me in Santa Fe, and she was doing this whole thing about the Inland Empire, which I have never heard about in Southern California. And there's this whole narrative around people who are from this particular town or however they're called to this town, and there's clear home Querencia kind of attachments to those. So I think this concept can be taken definitely to California, to Texas, and like Levi does is the Manitos up in Wyoming, and I know those have connections to New Mexico, but I know people up there and in Idaho who have built their own communities around these ideas of that landscape. And I think, yeah, absolutely, it can go to that.
So if I could jump in as well, because I think my chapter in the Querencia book is I kind of looked at like what it takes to maintain a cultural landscape from a collective perspective. So I kind of like, you know, kind of my chapter just kind of dives personally into like mapping out and this kind of like kind of the experiences from, you know, my grandparents to, you know, community organizations to, so what I kind of looked at it is kind of like, and I think this could, you know, and I kind of look at the work of Ariano and then kind of look at it in terms of like along the ideas of how folks are looking at the roles of traditional knowledge in maintaining ecosystems, right? And maintaining traditional lands and kind of the ways in which Western knowledge isn't working out so much in terms of managing forests and managing ecosystems, right? Because they're, at the end of the day, they're based in these neoliberal economic structures that are set to fail. So in my chapter, I look back and I think it can apply to other communities and other indigenous epistemologies and ways of knowledge and ways of knowing. So I kind of look at like, you know, the systems in which land and water systems function in the community, right? And then I look at you know, kind of the governance structures that relate to how those governing structures have to happen and work for those systems to maintain themselves. And then the cultural systems that are in play that kind of that connect those three systems. So that's what they are. They're basically the governance system, the natural systems, and the social structures and the mutualism, how they work in tandem. And if the social cultural starts falling apart, or the governance, traditional governance and knowledge system, the whole natural system just starts falling apart is what my main argument. So Querencia, I mean, can be mapped, and I would argue, because that's kind of what my chapter was, is about kind of this self-exploration and mapping in working with the community in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as a scholar and with my graduate students, and saying, wow, like I had an epiphany, like that's, you know, this is what, you know, this is how this works. And I think, you know, kind of like if you look at other communities, it's like, how are they engaged in their landscape? What are the collective knowledge systems? And if knowledge systems are broken, I even make the argument that sometimes we, in communities in northern New Mexico, we borrow, if a system's failed or something's has fallen apart, luckily there's some knowledge systems in neighboring communities that we can borrow from. So if you lose something, you think, goodness, you can pick it up and take that knowledge. And so that's how I think it's definitely transfer. I mean, other community, like I said, a lot of indigenous community call it the seventh generation concept, right? In indigenous communities, I think Querencia is just a New Mexico version of looking at that same concept. But I think it's a global indigenous perspective.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to add to that as well. Divina, thanks for joining us and for asking that question. Really, in my classes on my Querencia Home Place and Identity class, what we began with is the question of what is Querencia, and using Ariano's terminology, Querencia is the place where we feel safe, where we feel we belong, where we feel at home. And so we begin with that, and and the first assignment for the students is a cognitive map of where their Querencia is. And along with the cognitive map is also a short little write-up and a description of where that place is. And one of the most memorable ones for me from one of the students is that the student said that her Querencia, where she felt safe, where she felt nurtured, where she felt that she belonged, was all-night diners and homeless shelters, because she ran away from home when she was 15 years old. And for her, even in her early 20s now, that is still her Querencia. For other students, Querencia isn't a place, but it could be, again, something that's nurturing for them, which could be their art, their music, their writing. So there's all kinds of different ways that people take and define Querencia for themselves, rather than us defining what Querencia is for everybody. And that's what's beautiful about Querencia, right? Others, like Gloria Ansaldúa, you know, ¿qué dijo de, what did she say about language, right? Language is my home, because wherever we go, our home languages go with us. Our home language, what we grew up speaking, feeling, that helps us to make sense of the world, no matter where we are. And so language is also a form of Querencia too as well. Querencia is anything that makes you feel safe, nurtured, and like you belong. Whatever that is, that could be your Querencia.
It's funny that you mentioned Ansaldúa, Levi, because when I saw Liana's question pop up, that was like the first thing that came to mind for me. And I think maybe, at least in my mind, kind of bridging Divana's question with Liana's, the way I think of it, I never heard the word Querencia growing up. The concept was absolutely clear to me. And when the call went out for the Querencia book that Levi and Spencer and Vanessa co-edited, my mind went to doing something academic. And then I saw my colleagues' essays in there. I was like, tonta, why didn't I do something like that? Like it made, but you know, the way I think of it is a theory. Like Querencia is now this theoretical concept similar to Ansaldúa and Borderlands. And the way that there has been this entire world emerge out of Borderlands La Frontera, which is a beautiful book, and for so many people it's become like a second Bible to them, right? But I think that in thinking of, so to answer your question plainly, Divana, I think that it is a qualifiable theoretical concept that can be applied to anything now. That's my thinking. To answer Liana's question, you don't have to think about it. The beauty is that you don't have to use it in academic terms. It doesn't have to be a theoretical concept. And the way that in the 400 years, Taos where cultures met 400 years ago, the way Esteban says, como su mano, you know, it's like you recognize it like the back of your hand. It could be a smell, it could be, and that's the same way I teach it, like Levi's talking about. And I remember the first time that I taught it, it was in the class at Northern, and I had my students, I rolled out a big piece of butcher paper, and one afternoon we just sat there and drew, and they all drew their little querencias with like crayons and colored pencils, and like the things that emerge are just beautiful. So I guess my point is we don't have to be using that word to be talking about the sentiment and the framework and what it actually means. You can be in Texas, you can be in California, you can be anywhere and be talking about this place where you feel safe and that you know like the back of your hand.
I'm going to come in and read Leanna's question as well. So for those of you who aren't following the chat, great question from Leanna that says, so much dialogue is connected to academia. So how do we bridge the gap between these important conversations so that they translate to those of us who are not within academic circles or connections? And I don't know if anybody else would want to answer, but also, Esther, I'm going to ask you if you could jump in there also.
So maybe Querencia is not necessarily a physical location. It doesn't have to be a permanent address. It's not necessarily the coordinates to my parents' house. Although there are aspects within that home that remind me of the idea of Querencia. Querencia for me has become body, mind, and soul. And it has allowed me to reflect on what makes me strong. It has been like retracing and reclaiming the connectivity to people in particularly, or those cultural aspects that maybe I rejected as a young adult. For me, it has been like my mom's voice and her love for mariachis, or my dad's hands that map his humble life. For me, that brings safety and balance. It's not necessarily a location. In time, it has been what I have grown to miss, especially when we can't be together. Querencia has been cherished moments in my life that I can reflect on and, you know, that I hope to not overlook, you know, as I'm going about my day.
Can I speak? Is it okay if I share or ask a question? I'm a student, a graduate student at Cal State Northridge in the Chicano Studies Department. And I'm not, I only know of New Mexico. I've only visited it twice. My sister lives in Bernalillo County. I just love the way that you merge not your indigeneity with your culture, and I think it's a beautiful thing because where I live, everything is so it's just different in that sense that where, you know, I heard Levi talk about how the pandemic has affected Lent and the practices and the spiritual practices, and how that's like a form of embracing your Catholicity in a sense. And where I study, it's like it's almost taboo to speak about being Catholic in a sense, you know, because of the academia structure. And so I like the way that Leanna asked the question, like, for people who are not in academia, how do you translate or how do you intersect those two groups of people? And there's one professor where I currently attend, Rosa Rivera Futumoto, who teaches a class on social justice, but part of her class is teaching the students how to work with the Spanish-speaking community and their children. And so she teaches traditional ecological knowledge, which brings in all the water, what Moises was talking about, all those different aspects of what we forget about and how the community forgets that those pieces of their knowledge are very valuable to the community, even though we're like a, you know, normal city, and how the governance and the people have to work together. But I just love the way, like, all what you have been talking about is an aspect of this particular course that I took with this one professor, and it's really enlightening, and I'm going to research the panelist's name and learn more about the work that you do at UNM. So I just want to say thank you. It's been very enlightening.
Thank you so much for that comment and for the resource.
All right, are there any, oh, I'm gonna read this. We just got another question that just rolled into the chat, so I'm just gonna read it all out loud. This is from Divana again. What do you all think about Querencia as a politically mobilizing concept? Thinking here of our times, the convergence of a global refugee crisis, indigenous people protecting their land, and rising xenophobia and nationalism. So if anyone wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, anyone, I'll step in if anyone, is it go? No, I think a lot of the forces, at least in New Mexico, when we talk about, you know, where we're relating to, I think it's come up with Patricia a little bit about, I would say, maybe because I know, Patricia, your story and how you've talked about it in the past, so I kind of equate that to the violence of perpetual colonialism and white supremacy, right? And then I think about the military industrial complex that Myrriah's talking about it, and then the way in which Levi's saying a way in which, you know, this love of place becomes the love of place, and the need to maintain it becomes the consciousness, which becomes the political, right? That's not that's exactly what was going on with the No DAPL movement, right? In Standing Rock, you had a group of people, indigenous people, that said, no, we're not going to allow a pipeline to come ruin our lands. That call went out, and many indigenous communities went off and fought that fight and joined in solidarity, right? So in that aspect of solidarity, it becomes, you know, how does my consciousness of protecting a land base link between across indigenous consciousness of a land ethic that became a movement, right? DAPL became a thing, was a movement, right? And then, and so I think that's where Querencia and the knowledge and traditional knowledge systems of being place-based about how they become the ways in which we counter colonialism, neoliberalism, and white supremacy.
Divana, your question brings to mind a quote from Resolana, and the only reason I thought of this was because I was skimming through it earlier, where he's warning, or they're warning us not to create a fake romantic past in our rush to judge the present. I think that Querencia can be problematic, and there's a danger to it, right? Especially when we neglect to acknowledge that at least New Mexico, right, and other places, but New Mexico specifically has undergone 3 major periods of colonialism. And if we're not looking at it in terms of this palimpsest of Spanish colonialism happened first, and so many of our practices or our ties to Querencia are tied to the results of Spanish colonialism, then we start romanticizing it. And so I think that your question about indigenous people protecting their land, Levi and I talk about this all the time, you know, how there are all these dangers in talking about these without nuancing how the complications, right? They're not complicated, but they're complex. And I think that the easiest answer I can give you, or the simplest answer, it's not an easy answer, the simplest answer is I think it varies by community to community, and the danger lays in creating this overarching answer to the question, right? I think that you have to deal with communities and go into the communities and ask the players living in those communities, because only they know how they're living with each other and in those lands and in those communities. But I think that there is there's always been a xenophobia, right, in these lands, these occupied lands. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Is there anyone else who wants to jump in? Are there any other questions?
I'll jump in real quick. Leading into Vina's question, but also I guess going back a little bit to what Gina said, and I think that maybe why the panelists reflect this particular sense of querencia is because in some form or another, we are all, as panelists, a land-based people here in Nuevo Mexico. And so I think that's where our love for querencia comes from and why it shows through, and how everything that we talk about somehow is related to the landscape. In terms of this sort of political awareness and political activism, there's just no separation between who we are as querencieros and the cultural and social and political issues that confront us on a daily basis, right? But as part of that is the important relationship that we have and that we maintain, that we cultivate with the landscape, even as the stewards of the land, the U.S. Forest Service, for example, and the thinning of the forests, and when we're not allowed to use it for our resources, you know, what happens then? Then it leads to forest fires, no? The relationship imposed upon us from outsiders in terms of how they view our relationship to our vecinos, the pueblos and the other indigenous peoples as Nuevo Mexicanos, as Manitos, as Chicanos, you know, what really tends to be written about are the conflicts between these two peoples. But what is not written about is the harmonious, beautiful relationships that have endured for centuries. Otherwise, we could not have survived and lived side by side for so long, you know, and we know that nuestra gente would not have been able to survive without the aid of the indigenous peoples here. But it's been that symbiotic relationship ever since, and that is something that needs to be highlighted, that needs to be celebrated, needs something that also needs to be talked about while we're talking about the other conflicts and those other histories that are not such pretty histories to remember, right? And that's what makes us Nuevo Mexicanos. Eso es lo que somos. I think in some ways maybe that's what differentiates us from otra gente across the country, is that it is those relationships that we maintain with our vecindad y con la tierra madre, you know.
And if I could just jump in real quick thing, because it's just, and that's kind of coming back to something that, you know, Myrriah said about the danger of ways in which querencia can be taken out of the context of, in a not so good space. It's the ways in which the fabrications of the Oñate pageantry of the Española fiestas and the pageantry of the De Vargas fiestas was created, and actually was created by this movement to create economic development in Santa Fe in the turn of the last century, and propagated as, again, this neoliberal tool that lands up being so many years so divisive, and where you have, you know, folks kind of like anchored in this mythology of this Spanish American myth, right? So that's just an example how, you know, how the idea of querencia, that could, you know, that sort of form could go in a bad way quick.
I'd like to kind of follow up on that by looking at Luis's question here in the chat, where he says, noteworthy to me how difficult it is in New Mexico to even consider challenging power. Folks logically work to preserve, situate culture in its broadest sense towards bringing it into the present, future. But challenging for power is another thing. Dynamics here are super similar to what happens in Puerto Rico. In the face of domination and control, people struggle to hold on and even extend. And that is absolutely critical, but where does this ultimately lead? Even over the past year, where racism and white supremacy is front and center. Where is the conversation about white supremacy and Chicanos in New Mexico? This is just an example of what I am talking about. And I think that's what Moises was just talking about. And I'm gonna quote Myrriah here in that it's not complicated, but it is complex, because there was, you know, this conversation about, you know, Black Lives Matter and, you know, all this amazingly, you know, radical and really good conversation that came out of that, and, you know, structural changes. But here in New Mexico, when the statues were coming down, I don't know how, and this is probably a question I'm going to pose, I don't know how we talk about white supremacy here, because it is wrapped up in this discourse of whiteness around Spain. And these statues coming down was part of that. So I don't quite know. I know from my experience, I come across it a lot of the times when it comes to indigeneity and whiteness and indigeneity here. But I don't really know how to address it. I just know it's something that I always want to talk about. I know how to talk about it in Texas, because in Texas, it's pretty in your face white supremacy. Here, I'm not quite sure how to talk about it. But I just wanted to bring that question so that way everybody saw it.
Well, and it's also more complex, you know, in there's that word again, in thinking about your question, because it's not, the tricultural myth of New Mexico is just that, it's a myth. We saw last week a state legislator question the qualifications of an African-American appointee, nominee, right, to a cabinet position. And so, you know, we have to acknowledge all of our vecinos in New Mexico and that long legacy and history, and not just perpetuate that tricultural myth that happens so often either.
I also think, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to say this too. And I'm going to do a little bit of a marketing thing for a podcast that we just did at the NHCC on Afro-Latinidad. And one of the questions that we asked was, we were talking about Afro-Latinos in Puerto Rico and in the Caribbean, but about, you know, where is that presence, or how do we talk about that presence in New Mexico? Because like Myrriah is saying, it's here. It is here, you know, from the very beginning, there's been Afro-Latino communities here. It isn't part of our mainstream discourse, but it's present. And so again, like when the statues came down, and I'm just going to keep using my family as an example, because I have a lot of family in northern New Mexico who were very upset when that happened. And, you know, for them, it felt like an assault on their, you know, on their heritage. At the same time, and this is part of the contradiction, those exact same people will be very proud of indigenous backgrounds. So it's always this thing that exists simultaneously. And, you know, so when you said that about Puerto Rico, that's what it reminded me of, because we just talked about this in the context of Puerto Rico earlier in the week.
Is there any more questions here? Does anybody want to offer any kind of closing thoughts as we kind of close out our afternoon? All right, well, I just want to thank you all so much. This has been such a complex and nuanced conversation. It's been a really nourishing conversation for me. I feel like there's just a lot of richness in all of the ways that you all think about and speak about these ideas that are so important to understanding ourselves, our paths, our futures, and our interconnectedness, and our relationship to place and to space and to each other. So it's just been really wonderful. I appreciate it so much. I want to thank everyone who hung in here and you know, participated in our conversation. It was a great second half of our conversation. It's really, really wonderful. So thank you all. Go out and enjoy some time outdoors in our beautiful landscape. Enjoy this wonderful afternoon. If you want to unmute and say anything, this is a great time to do that. Thank you so much. It's been really, really wonderful. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Esther, for the invitation and for the exhibit. It's beautiful. It's been a nice place to walk the few times I've gotten to go to Albuquerque. So thank you so much.
You.
Yeah, I want to say thanks again to all the panelists and everyone for participating. Definitely a super thought-provoking conversation and something that I think we'll continue to reflect on. So appreciate you all.
Thank you, everybody. It was wonderful to see and hear you all.
Thank you.
Santas y buenas tardes, les de Dios.
I'll reflect on what somebody else said. When oh bye.
Bueno, bye. I'll see you soon.